Kali, as the Hindu goddess, she represents similarly to Shiva in a way that's like connected. She's representative of death and destruction, and her name literally translates to time. So she's, like master of death. She's a universal mother. So there's a lot with, what she represents that has to do with the life, death, rebirth cycle of the universe, which also ties into, the number 8, because the 8 is an infinity symbol. It's similar to the Ouroboros and what it represents, in that it is the natural principle of things, that there is loss and there is death that is inevitable, and from that, new life and new beginnings occur, and that's something that nobody has any control over. And it's a deeply painful truth. It's something that on a philosophical, through a philosophical lens, a lot of human beings, most of us struggle very deeply with that. We have a deep sort of pain and distrust towards that part of life, right? Especially as we get older and we experience challenges, we have to mature, we experience pain, and we experience losses, sometimes losses that we expect, and sometimes losses that we have no expectation to go through. And I think that Kali as a character in the show represents all of that really beautifully. She represents that power struggle and that, again, very deep human wound that we all have, where we don't have control over what happens to us. We don't have control over some of the most painful experiences that we go through. We don't have control over what we lose and when we lose, and who we lose, and when we lose those people, and she's a character, who, of course, similar to 11, to all of the kids who were being experimented on in the lab, has undergone tremendous pain and like lack of control, violation. She's gone through so much in her life, and when we first meet her in season 2, she is coping with that as best as she can. She's taking on this role, sort of as a demon slayer in her own way, trying to hunt down all of these people who have harmed her, who have harmed her friends, who she's in this gang with. And she's coping, by trying to master her fear and anger in a way that, she's instructing 11 to do in season 2. And I think, when we're watching, we can tell that she's very controlled by her fear, as we might expect, given, the things that she's experienced. She hasn't really transcended as much as she thinks that she has at that point in her journey. And when we meet her again in season 5, and she's gone through even more horrible experiences at this point, you can see how beaten down she is. And I find it really interesting that a lot of people, not everybody, but a lot of people really don't like her and don't like the thing, her idea, her perspective on things and what she's suggesting to 11 in the show. But I actually think that her point is really valid, and it's a perspective that makes a lot of sense, not just because of, taking into consideration what she's gone through and why she would, see things the way that she sees things because of her experiences, but also because she is a deeply caring person. She's witnessed it. In season 5, we learn this information that Kay has restarted this program that Dr. Brenner initially started, that 11, Jane, and Kali were a part of, right? And Kali discovers that Dr. K has been harvesting her blood in order to infuse it into a bunch of pregnant women. It also seems that this is probably not consensual, that these women don't want this to be happening to them. these blood infusions are killing them. They all seem to be isolated. They're kept in these really, bare, horrible rooms. And you can see how much this naturally disturbs Kali, not just because she has experienced, been a victim to something similar, but also because she is a deeply loving person who has been put through terrible circumstances and had to adapt, usually by herself. It isn't until she meets Jane that she has somebody who she can really relate to in this pain that she's experienced in her life. And we get this again callback into Kali, the Hindu goddess's symbolism, because there's this, when we see these pregnant women that Kali comes across, it's this really interesting, sad, disturbing depiction of that life, death, life symbology that Kali represents, when we think about the original set of kids, including Henry, Henry 8, 11, they were innocent little children who were taken advantage of and violated. That new life, that exists in babies and in little children should always be protected and treated as sacred. But it wasn't in them. It was immediately violated and disrespected and harmed. And we see it happening again, that instead of these pregnant women being protected, instead of their autonomy and their physical health being respected, they are being killed. They're being used. And I can only imagine, from Kali's perspective, how tremendously disturbing that would be to see that not only was her blood being harvested in disturbing quantities, but it's also being used to harm a bunch of other women and their children. It's such a disturbing visual, and beyond the visual, what it means, it's really dark. And that's why I think it's kind of weird that people kind of brush aside Kali's significance in this story, because she understands and has witnessed this terrible reality, and really understands the gravity of that, because that's kind of what her arc in this story is, is having to hold the severity of these circumstances on her own in so many ways. And 11 has to do that too in another way, but there's a certain power struggle, this struggle for control that 8 experiences in particular. And it's interesting because, when we look at the number 8 in tarot as well, 8 is a really it's a powerful number. And 8, the character, she sort of is stuck in a very 8 of Swords type of mentality. And it's totally understandable, given everything that she's gone through. She is very trapped in her fear. She is very trapped in her paranoia. And it's not that her insights are wrong. It's not that she doesn't bring up valuable insights and things that are important for 11 to consider, things that are important for the viewers to consider when we're watching this story, and trying to understand the deeper underlying the themes of this show. She brings a really, really deep, valuable insight and a depth to the show, but at the same time she is paralyzed, by the things that have happened to her, and it prevents her from being able to perceive any other possibilities sometimes, where there are other characters who I think sometimes they have more hope than she does. She's very cynical, and she has good reason to be, right? It makes a lot of sense. And when I watched the show and I saw her suggesting to 11 that the best thing for them to do would be to, essentially allow themselves to be destroyed in order to prevent the horrible, the cycle of abuse and violation from happening. A lot of people, are very angry at her for suggesting that. And it is a very sad, grim suggestion, of course. But again, it makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense given who she is and what she's been through. And I think that when we look at her relationship with 11, they kind of balance each other out in a way. Because they're both deeply loving, and like, I think 11 in particular, she's a really beautiful character because she is so consistently compassionate and connective. She's like a very relationally oriented person, even though she's been through, also like, sorry, the camera, horrifically difficult, scary things. She continues reaching out to people. She always wants to try and mend wounds between people. She allows for a lot of relational healing within the show and a lot of growth because of how open and vulnerable she is. And, the fact that like she just can't help but hide what she's feeling and what's really going on. And she's a source of a lot of natural honesty, And I think that she brings out a vulnerability in 8 and in Hopper, which I'll get to Hopper in a moment, but she is really vital in giving people hope. And she's consistent in being that person who continues reaching out, continues believing in the strength of a relationship and trying to feed into it, right? And 8... she's also a little older than 11, I think. I think they have a bit of an age gap. Maybe not by so much, but she's older. She's a little bit more jaded. And she's been isolated in a different way than 11 has been. And I think that she gives you this insight into the deeper awareness that 11 has about the reality of things. People like to infantilize 11. That's kind of an issue, especially when it comes to Mike and Hopper, who are both male influences in her life, who are very important and very, nurturing, loving people in her life. But they do have this tendency sometimes to turn her into a kind of one-dimensional figure, or see her as kind of a child, like a baby who needs to be overly protected, especially with Hopper. But Mike has had moments of being overprotective as well. And so there's sometimes, they get in the way of you being able to see the fullness of 11's awareness and her intelligence. But Kali, she brings out this depth, this maturity in 11 because they have that shared history. They can be honest with each other in a way that they can't with anybody else. They understand each other in a way that nobody else does. And, even when it comes to viewers, I think there are viewers that infantilize 11. But she knows, like, she understands the unspoken truths of what they're dealing with. She even tries to say this to Mike, when she says, this isn't like one of your campaigns. You don't get to choose the ending, It's not just Kali that feels the way that she feels about the reality of the situation and what she thinks they need to do about it. It's a truth, again, the reality of that universal human experience of like, we all have to face our mortality, and we all have to face the loss of loved ones or the loss of previous stages of life. We all have to face our pasts. She has to do this too. 11 has to go through this process of deciding for herself who she is and what everything means to her and what decisions she wants to make. And she's the only person who gets to decide that. And I think that 8, Kali, actually helps her do that. And she helps her do that in a way that Hopper doesn't like and a lot of viewers don't like. because again, they like to infantilize 11. They don't really want to have to think of the full depth of what she's experienced and what that means for how she's going to grow and develop as a full, a full person. That she's not going to be that little girl that we first met in season 1 forever, right? She is going to grow and change. She is going to make her own choices that are going to hurt. Like, when you're watching the show, you care about these characters so much that you don't want to think about having to lose any of them, right? And that's what Kali reminds you of. And interestingly enough, we don't really spend a lot of time with Kali. We got 1 episode with her in season 2 when we were first introduced, and then we don't see her again until season 5. And I think that speaks to that level of distrust, that people push her character away because it's easier to push away the people that scare you, the people that bring up that sense of, you don't have control. We don't have any control over who we lose, right? And people don't want to deal with that. And they see her as the issue instead of thinking, whatever it is that she represents to you personally as a viewer. If you understandably are uncomfortable with that, it's not really because of her. It might just be because of your own fear of loss, right? Which is natural. But I think that's so beautiful that she represents that. And I think the viewer response to her character is like amusing. I think it's so telling, in its own way. And with Hopper, Hopper, of course, we see throughout the show is still dealing with the grief of losing his daughter when she was still very young. And we know that his relationship with 11 stirs up a lot of those wounds, and part of it is that he never got to watch his daughter grow up. And with 11, he's reaching milestones as a parent that he never got to reach with Sarah, his daughter. And he's having to really confront a lot of stuff within himself that would have been buried underneath the surface had he not met 11 and become a parental figure for her. But Hopper, he kind of seems, as much as he's a survivor and he's experienced really challenging physical circumstances throughout the show, that he survived and had a will to survive, there's also a part of him that seems sort of like he has a bit of a death wish. Like, he has a level of self-abandon. Maybe he's still punishing himself. Maybe he blames himself for his daughter's death. Maybe he says that in the show, does he? I can't really remember at some point if he's, especially because of the Agent Orange of it all, like when he was in the war and that being the reason that his daughter had cancer. There's a part of him where even if rationally he knows there's nothing that he could have done and it wasn't his fault and he didn't know what he didn't know, there's part of him that I think blames himself for what happened to his daughter, and he still holds on to that and still has a bit of a death wish. And that's why he's so willing to kind of blow himself up sometimes. Like, he kind of has his fail-safe plan of blowing himself up with Henry if he ever finds Vecna in the Upside Down during one of his crawls, right? And in a similar way, 8, Kali, she also has a bit of a death wish in a way. When she suggests to 11, we should probably stay back, when they enact their whole plan to kind of banish and destroy the Upside Down and the connection to the other dimension. She doesn't know what else to do with her pain and her fear besides try and sacrifice herself to protect the world and the people that she cares about in that world. Even the people that she doesn't know, she's thinking about these future children that might be devastated by the same circumstances that she has been exposed to and forced into. She's trying to do the only thing that she knows how to do in order to protect herself and protect a future reality. In the same way that Hopper is also doing that. They're similar in that way, and they both feel a level of closeness, love, and protection towards 11 that allows them to reach a vulnerability within themselves that they don't get in the same way with anybody else. And when Hopper meets Kali, he, like a lot of viewers who don't like Kali, he has to confront the fact that Jane is her own person, and he, you know, has to confront that throughout the show. That's one of the defining features of Jane and Hopper's relationship, is he has to learn how to let go. And we see that with Joyce and Will as well. These, you know, really beautiful, like, parent-child relationships where they're like, okay, I'm gonna have to learn how to back off sometimes, and you know better than me sometimes. We have to learn to trust each other. You know, he has to go through that journey throughout the show. But ultimately, he also is, of course, deeply afraid of losing Eleven. He doesn't want her to die. He doesn't want to lose her in his life. He even says that, you know, when they're talking in season 5 and Eleven is, you know, cleaning his wound. Kali is that, like, constant reminder that, like, he has no control over that. He might lose this person that he loves very deeply as his own daughter now, and that's why he doesn't like Kali. It's not really because Kali is bad. It's not because she is wrong in her perspective and in her insights. It's just that it's horrifying to think about losing the people that you love the most. And I think that that's what, you know, makes this show so interesting and so beautiful. Is as much as, like, the world building and the monsters and the sci-fi of it all is so much fun and, like, so original in a lot of ways. It's like, it's so fun to watch the show, but I think what really makes it land is the character relationships and their development, you know, the way that they all mature as individuals, the decisions that they make, the courage that they choose to step into, and then, you know, again, the relationships, the honesty between the characters and what they bring out within each other. It's just so human. Like, so much of it is just so beautifully acknowledging of the complexities and the pains of the human experience. And I think that that's why this show is really special, because of how they've captured all of those angles and so many different characters. And yeah, I think that Kali is a beautiful character, and I'm not sure what they're gonna do with her in the show. I don't know if she's gonna die or if she's gonna get her own sort of rebirth, renewal, like her own new life in a way, or if she is gonna try and sabotage. I don't know. Maybe she is gonna pull a trick. I have no idea. But I'm curious to see, and, you know, regardless of what happens to her, I think that she's still a very fascinating character and brings a lot of depth to those underlying themes in the show that we don't always talk about as directly. But she's great. I really enjoy what her character represents, and I'm curious if you also like her character, if you don't like her character, whatever. If you have any other ideas or connections for what she represents, feel free to comment. But yeah.